Once again, welcome. If you saw my video about roadshow programs, you saw me give you a glimpse of these programs from Mary Poppins, which was not a roadshow movie, but could have been. So again today, we're only going to have a glimpse of these because we're going to take a look at Mary Poppins, but through its music and the various ways that the music was presented in 1964. It's August, and August is a Mary Poppins month because in 1963, Mary Poppins was being filmed here in Burbank at the Walt Disney Studios, and in August 1964, it had its great premiere in Hollywood and was released to great acclaim. You know, it's kind of funny because it's a little bit challenging to talk about Mary Poppins because everything's been said about this extraordinary film that was known as Walt Disney's greatest achievement because it pulled together everything that Walt had perfected: animation, live action, special effects, even audio animatronics, and of course music. I mean, what can you say about Mary Poppins? It's almost like there has to be a special word to describe how remarkable it is, how extraordinary it is. Kind of a super superlative. If only there was such a word. Oh, that's right. There is. Now, if you've ever asked yourself, what was the best-selling LP album of 1965? And you said, probably something by the Beatles. I'm sorry, you'd be wrong, because the best-selling LP album of 1965 is right here. You're looking at it. The original cast soundtrack of Mary Poppins. We've already seen a glimpse of this key art by Disney artist Paul Wenzel. And this key art was used on the posters, ads, and certainly here on the cover of the soundtrack album. This art was very significant because, as you can see, it's a very sophisticated approach. Various styles and designs were considered, but Walt Disney decided that what was needed for this very special motion picture was a very special approach. He wanted to emphasize that this was a world-class musical thanks to the songs of the Sherman brothers. So he asked for an approach that would emphasize this could have been a Broadway musical. And at any rate, it was an entertainment spectacular. Hence the neon sign with Walt's name and these bright lights with the title and the names of the stars. And this very sophisticated approach that really doesn't even tell you anything about the movie. In fact, Julie Andrews is not even really as she's seen in the film, and Dick Van Dyke has his straw hat from the Jolly Holiday sequence, but again, that could be from almost anything. So it's really suggesting this spectacular that's going to have song and dance stars, stars of the stage and screen, and seems to be saying, just come see it. You'll be wowed. Because remember, if you were seeing this in 1964, before its August premiere, you didn't necessarily know what Mary Poppins was. Certainly the books by P.L. Travers were popular, but they were not all that well known. In fact, when Walt talked to the Sherman brothers about the project, they had not heard of the books. And even Julie Andrews, who grew up in England where they had been published originally, she had heard of Mary Poppins, but didn't really know what it was. She had never read the books. So this presentation that was on the poster and here on the LP just gave a sense of something that was spectacular, something that was special, something that was unique, something that you just had to come see and experience for yourself. And it certainly worked. Because as we all know, Mary Poppins was a smash hit, as were the songs, as was this album. This original cast soundtrack was released on Disney's prestige Vista label, but of course there were other Mary Poppins albums. The songs were so great that Disneyland Records knew they had hits on their hands, so they wanted to present them in as many forms as possible. For example, there was the second cast album, which had covers of the songs, 10 songs from Walt Disney's Mary Poppins. The great logo here that we all love with Mary Poppins in place of the I. And it really is spectacular in its own way. But I'd like to tell you a secret about this album, which I'll do later. Some of you already know what it is, I'm sure. Can the rest of you guess? I'll tell you about that later in the video. Now, this original soundtrack album was released in two forms, mono and stereo. And I'm going to use the stereo cover to show you a little bit about it. They are the same. It was only the recording that was different. But it's really great because inside is this gatefold, and again, indicating that this was something special. And there's this beautifully written synopsis of the film. If you've never read this, I really encourage you to do so. It's a treat. And I've always wondered if it was written by Bill Walsh, who was the co-producer, co-writer of Mary Poppins. It's so beautifully written. And then we have this here on the side, which is kind of the background of the making of the film, indicating that, again, this was something very special. Again, beautifully written. And Bill Walsh had started out as a PR writer, so I wonder if he was just drawing upon his original skills. Now, Mary Poppins was re-released in 1973. That was a big deal. So the original soundtrack album was, of course, also reissued. And it was decided that they didn't want to use the same art in exactly the same way, even though the posters were the same, to kind of give an indication that here was something that should be experienced again. So again, they went with the whole idea of making this sort of a wow, taking this idea of the marquee lights and running with it. Take a look at how they handled it in 1973. To me, this is great. This was spectacular for the first release, but if they were going to do something special for the reissue in 1973, I think this was a great approach. Just bang, it's a wow. And since they weren't using the Julie Andrews, Dick Van Dyke portraits at all, they used an element that was also used on some of the posters to indicate that, yes, here's Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, and they're dancing, indicating that it's this great musical. So to me, this is a terrific reimagining of the album, and it's really one of my favorites. What's unfortunate is there's no gatefold inside the album cover. It's just a regular album cover. And also at this time, Vista started releasing its albums just in plain white sleeves, as opposed to these wonderful Vista sleeves, which really gave a special indication of the great prestige releases on the Vista label. Exciting sounds on Vista, the label of distinction. Beginning in 1980, Disneyland Records started reissuing some of its soundtracks in the picture disc form. So here's Mary Poppins again, the original motion picture soundtrack, minus a few elements like the overture. And these picture discs really were very cool, with the artwork sort of embedded in the disc itself. And the side one image is really cool, with Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke and the Jolly Holiday sequence. Now, I have to admit, the back I'm not that excited by. Don't get me wrong. I love Dick Van Dyke. Love this picture. It's great, and it's pretty unique because it's not something you see every day. But especially given that the whole movie's about Mary Poppins, Julie Andrews is a huge star. I feel that it should either be Mary Poppins by herself, or again, Mary Poppins and Bert together in some way. But on the other hand, it is such a great picture, it's hard to complain. Now, so far we've talked about these recordings, but I also want to talk about a couple of books. So we have here Practically Poppins in Every Way. This is a celebration of the entire Mary Poppins phenomenon. So it's very wide-ranging, from the books all the way up to Mary Poppins Returns. And this book was issued in 2018 to go along with the release of Mary Poppins Returns, starring Mrs. John Krasinski, better known to everyone as Emily Blunt. So here we have on the cover art based on Mary Poppins Returns. It's written by Jeff Curdy, so you know it's good. But what's not clear right off the bat is that there are other authors involved too, because Jeff invited a group of writers to explore different aspects of the Mary Poppins phenomenon. And some of those writers include Fox Carney, Brian Sibley, Greg Ehrbar, Craig Barton, Paula Sigmund Lowry, and yes, even I was invited to write for this remarkable volume. So my essay is inside this book as well. So anyone who has not yet obtained this book for their own library, I strongly urge you to do so. I may be biased, but I think it's great. And if you love Mary Poppins, you're going to love this book. But now let's take a look at a book that was released in 1964/1965, along with the release of the movie. This is the complete musical score from Walt Disney's Mary Poppins. As you can see, once again, we have the key art here on the cover, the same Broadway-style marquee lights, the tagline, Walt Disney's greatest achievement, which it was being acclaimed as by, as the ad said, everyone. And we have the element of Mary Poppins and Bert dancing here. Now, one reason I said 1964/1965 is because in April of 1965, the music of Mary Poppins was awarded 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Original Score, one for Best Song, Chim Chim Cheree. So this was reissued with the Academy Award on it from that point on. And this was also done with the sheet music. I don't have an example because I don't own any of the sheet music, but I do own this book, so let's take a look. What's really great, first of all, is that it says including commentary by the composers, who of course are the great Richard M. Sherman and Robert B. Sherman. And there is wonderful behind-the-scenes stories here. Here's P.L. Travers. But over here we have the Sherman brothers describing how the songs were written and some of the behind-the-scenes stories. Now look at the size of this book. Aside from the sheet music, here's Chim Chim Cheree. It is chock full of photos and descriptions and behind-the-scenes stories, even aside from the Sherman Brothers commentary. For example, musical direction, Irwin Costell. Look at Julie Andrews here on the rehearsal stage in her street clothing. These are photos you just don't see very often. Animation, special effects, on and on. Just absolutely terrific. And then biographies of the cast. Julie Andrews, Dick Van Dyke, and so forth. This book is an absolute treasure, and I'm sure many people bought it just to have the music so they could play it on the piano themselves, but there's all this wonderful content that you weren't going to get anywhere else. So there's this really cool little introduction here I'd like to read to you. Mary Poppins steps from the pages of unforgettable literature to become the vivacious dancing and singing heroine of Walt Disney's sparkling musical fantasy, Mary Poppins. Almost from the day the enchanting, elusive Mary Poppins character appeared on the scene in 1934, from the pen of P.L. Travers, she seemed destined to gain additional fame as a motion picture immortal. Well, certainly Walt Disney thought that. Not so sure about P.L. Travers, but that's what ended up happening. And as it goes on to say, and now filmed in Technicolor and enhanced by some of the brightest, most original tunes ever written for a film musical, how true is that? Mary Poppins emerges as a supreme achievement of master showman Walt Disney. Here then is the complete musical score to Walt Disney's motion picture, Mary Poppins. And that brings us back to the recordings. And I promised I would tell you something very special about this second cast recording. Now, if you notice up here, Marni Nixon sings the role of Mary Poppins. Very interesting, because Marni Nixon was famous for ghost singing for such stars as Natalie Wood in West Side Story and Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady. Bill Lee sings the role of Bert, and he too was a ghost singer. He sang for Christopher Plummer in The Sound of Music, opposite Julie Andrews. Bill Lee was also a member of the musical group The Mellow Men, along with Thurl Ravenscroft. And as we know, Walt Disney often used the Mellow Men for projects such as Lady and the Tramp. But most interesting of all is this name, Richard M. Sherman. That's right, this album features one half of the Sherman Brothers songwriting team, in this case singing I Love to Laugh as Uncle Albert. And it's just the most delightful performance. Of course, it's quite different from Ed Wynn's performance in the movie, but that's as it should be. This is a second cast. So if you have a chance to listen to Richard Sherman's performance on this album, please do. It's absolutely delightful. Well, as that certain word indicates, there's so much more that could be said about Mary Poppins. So we'll definitely be revisiting Mary Poppins in a future video. But for now, enough is as good as a feast. So we'll see you next time.